Frontier Theories, Module 5 assignment. This week we have researched Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis. His thesis describes the frontier as a process and provides a lens to explore Manifest Destiny's role in the United States as we attempt to dominate the stars, skies, seas, and depths of the earth. In this essay, I will briefly explain Manifest Destiny and summarize Turner's Frontier Thesis. I will reflect on the concept of Manifest Destiny in current American exploration. I will explain how Manifest Destiny is alive and well in the culture and attitude of the United States government, American-owned multinational corporations, and in people like me. The final frontier I will discuss is the space of low Earth orbit. The number of satellites in orbit and the debris created by them are not regulated, making this a sort of Wild West with no sheriff to keep order. It is apparent that we Americans pushed into this frontier without considering future costs because we felt we had the right to do so. Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny is a term coined by journalist and Jacksonian Democrat John L. O'Sullivan in 1845. He believed that it was a God-given right for the United States to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. He also thought that no other nation had a right to prevent the U.S. from doing so. This belief was never an official policy of the United States government, but President James K. Polk shared it. Polk used this belief as justification to go to war with Mexico over the annexation of Texas. The philosophy also led the way to California and Oregon becoming a part of the United States by making sea to shining sea a reality. Manifest Destiny was supposed to bring democracy and liberty to the lands where Americans settled. This is, of course, if you were white, Protestant, and of European descent. The policy also influenced the continuing of slavery and excluding of native peoples and other non-white or Catholics or other religious groups from having equal rights. The policy of Manifest Destiny did not end on the Pacific coast of North America. In the 20th century, the United States annexed Hawaii. The Philippines, Samoa, Cuba, and Puerto Rico also came under U.S. control during this period. Similarly, the wants and needs of the people already living in these areas were not considered important when making the decision to annex them. Summary of Turner's Frontier Theory. Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Theory rose out of a paper he read during a meeting of the American Historical Association at the 1893 World Columbian Exposition. He referenced the 1890 census, which declared that there was no longer a distinct line of settlement. Turner went on to describe the frontier as a process rather than an actual place. In laying out his thesis, he described how the waves of settlement at the frontier created a distinctly American culture rather than an extension of European culture. The paper explained the cycle of settlement that begins when individuals moved into the wilderness. The individual must conform to the ways of the wilderness to survive, but he will inevitably leave his mark on it. The successive waves include small groups of families creating like-minded communities for support. The process continues until a town becomes a city, and once again pioneers strike out to less crowded areas. Each successive wave of the frontier west created a uniquely American point of view. Turner described the efforts of the East Coast elites to rein in and guide the advance of the frontier. He cited the English government during colonial times in gerrymandering by the Virginia Tidewater and South Carolina politicians to ensure the coast dominance in their legislatures as examples. This view of the East Coast elites still exists today, and the resentment that goes with it. The description of how democracy sprang up on the frontier struck me as familiar in light of the wave of nationalism in the United States today. Turner said, "So long as free land exists, the opportunity for competency exists, and economic power secures political power. But the democracy born of a free land, strong in selfishness and individualism, Intolerance for administrative experience and education and pressing individual liberty beyond its proper bounds has its dangers as well as its benefits. He goes on to say, individualism in America has allowed a laxity in regard to governmental affairs, which has rendered possible the spoils system and all the manifest evils that follow from the lack of highly developed civic spirit. This and more that he explained in this section of the paper could easily describe how many people in 2021 feel about restraint and constraint by the federal government. It also seems that this having it both ways extends to American-owned multinational corporations that want to earn money in other countries and avoid paying taxes both there and here. This selfish individualism and lack of civic spirit are still strong in the American culture in the 21st century. The final frontier. I usually think of space, the final frontier, as the faraway prospect of interplanetary and intergalactic travel. I take for granted that all the problems involved with getting there will be naturally solved. These issues that come to mind are the scientific ones, like how we can travel fast enough to get to another planet or solar system before everyone on board is dead. It irks me, though, when I watch space sci-fi shows, since they all have some kind of artificial gravity technology. I wonder how this could be, or how much energy must be involved in producing such a thing, but I have taken very little time to consider what issues must be solved long before we can use a warp drive engine, to travel beyond Earth's orbit. A significant area of space is being utilized today by low Earth orbit satellites used for communications. The space surrounding the Earth is beginning to get crowded. New satellites being launched by governments and private companies increase the amount of traffic in orbit around the planet. And these satellites don't last forever. They can malfunction, they can be destroyed accidentally in a collision or intentionally by anti-satellite technology. The debris must be accounted for when determining launch trajectories to avoid a catastrophic incident. Descriptions of the debris field orbiting Earth remind me of the garbage islands that are currently growing and floating in our oceans. No one anticipated this could happen when we embraced plastic as a wave of the future in the mid-20th century. I indeed never considered the effect of how my choices to embrace packaged foods and plastic items on the planet, how my choices to embrace packaged goods and plastic items on the planet long after I am gone. Now it seems that the unintended consequence of improving communication by increasing the amount of stuff in orbit may also keep us from exploring outside the orbit of the Earth. How can we explore the solar system if we are blocked from escaping Earth by the belt of space trash? The laws implemented in the 20th century about space did not anticipate that smaller countries and private entities would contribute to the objects in orbital space. There has been no legal update since then. According to Martinez 2019, there are some agreements about best practices, but there is no hard law or consequences if governments or other entities violate the agreements. He describes this frontier space as the Wild West, in need of a sheriff to keep order. It is not surprising that we humans are in this predicament. This type of scenario has played out repeatedly, especially in modern times, when innovation and capability outrun laws and legal systems. In this case, the need for regulatory consideration calls for a consensus and consequences with legal consensus, and consequences when legal consensus is breached. Still, I am skeptical that will be accomplished without a lot more loss. I have heard it said that people tend to change only when the pain of staying the same becomes more significant than the pain of change. This theory may also apply to nations and corporations, preventing the creation of regulations that could restrain them from freely exercising their rights. Reflection. I have been a Star Trek fan for most of my life. I like all the series. I like how it makes me think. It is not so much a show about the exploration of the galaxy or the voyage of the Starship Enterprise. as it is about exploring how human beings think, act, and make choices. In most of the series, a lot of the technological problems with space have been solved, but learning to live with others that are different from us is a constant theme. Star Trek's prime directive is a principle of non-interference. It is held as the most important ethical consideration for space exploration. The idea is interesting because it gives importance to the notion that any one species or group does not have the divine right to interfere or put its interests above those of another group. In a way, the prime directive is anti-manifest destiny. However, putting an ideal that asks people to put others' needs ahead of their own is challenging to live out even in the Star Trek universe. But at least the principle of considering the long-term consequences of one's actions and the consideration that it is not our right to impose them on others is at play. The me-first culture that seems a natural outgrowth of having particular privilege concerns me when thinking about how America continues to explore and exploit frontiers today. The frontier for settlement on Earth may be closed, but plenty of places are left unexplored, both literal and virtual. Technology and its uses and the ethical questions surrounding it, the power and influence held by multinational corporations like Facebook and Amazon, and the exploration to find an effective way to overcome COVID-19 are all examples of the frontier. However, I chose something that hasn't been getting as much buzz in front-facing media that concerns how humans can realize interplanetary space travel. A few things that come to mind when I consider why humans don't seem to try to anticipate the long-term consequences of any progress involved in exploration. One is that some studies show that some people have lower tolerance to delayed gratification. Follow-up studies indicate that those who are better at delaying gratification as children are more successful adults, according to the Stanford Marshmallow Experiment. Marketing also works hard to overcome delayed gratifications by making things appear too challenging to resist. This type of marketing is targeted to children and adults through to the end of life. I get emails every day from businesses that I like trying to convince me that I need to order now. I love the technology that allows me to type this paper on an electronic device and share it through the cloud to my instructor 1,500 miles away in a flash. I love how commonplace it is for me to look things up on a whim instead of remaining in the dark about any question I have, or having to go to the trouble to find out the answer. To do that, there are not only devices on each end of the communication, but also instruments orbiting the Earth to transmit the signal. How many? I don't know. It never occurred to me to wonder until recently. I never wondered how many satellites would be needed to continue to be launched. I never wondered how many would become obsolete, and then what would become of them. I think this is another way the philosophy of manifest destiny is still at work. Technology makes my life better, so I want it. I have not considered how it came to be or what the consequences are. I believe that a similar paradigm exists in the corporate world. We will launch those satellites and figure out what to do with them later. Turner's thesis has a lot of problems. It does not consider the point of view of any other group than men of European descent. However, I think this description of how the movement westward created an individualism that is antisocial and that produces an antipathy to control, and particularly any direct control, is an accurate way to describe what we see today in the rise of nationalism. The older I get, the more I realize that I have taken a great many things for granted. I have asserted my rights by being able to move and communicate freely. I have not considered that my experience does not extend to all. I have not considered the long-term consequences on myself, others, and on the planet. I find myself in a constant state of needing to reevaluate how the choices I make have already made an effect on a broader world. I am trying to learn to consider the prime directive in my choices over blindly believing in manifest destiny. Conclusion. The concept of manifest destiny still exists. The American culture that Turner described in his frontier thesis may only apply to a particular group. Nevertheless, this group dominates most of the political and economic power in the United States today. The actions of the government of the United States and the American-owned multinational corporations in populating the orbital space above Earth illustrates this point. The technology and opportunity have moved much faster than the legal system, resulting in space becoming a Wild West danger zone. The desire to move into the wilderness of space and the freedom to do so reflects the same kind of selfish individualism described by Turner in his frontier thesis. The right to explore and exploit outweighs any other consideration.